In the dead of winter, 1887, Scotland Yard sealed a case file so disturbing it remained classified for over 90 years. Hidden within were detailed reports of 7 savage murders that haunted the prestigious district of Belmar, London's newly risen seat of wealth for 8 straight months. Each victim was discovered with an identical symbol etched into their chest and faint traces of a mysterious substance that left them frozen in death. With wide, contorted grins that resembled laughter more than pain. But what truly unnerved investigators wasn't the brutality, it was what came after. Time and again, neighbors reported hearing laughter echoing from the victims' homes. Hours after they had been declared dead by the coroner, the case was abruptly closed when the lead investigator, Inspector Thomas Wycliffe, vanished without a trace. The only thing he left behind was a note barely legible in ink that had begun to run. The laughter never stops. It follows you home. Before we descend deeper into one of London's most chilling unsolved mysteries, take a moment to subscribe to Sleepy History Tales and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. These stories are more than legend. They are cautionary whispers from history's darkest corners. What the authorities buried wasn't just the signature of a killer, but proof of just how far Victorian society's elite would go to preserve their image. Even if it meant letting a murderer roam free, veiled by fog and privilege. In 1887, London wasn't just a city. It was the beating heart of the largest empire the world had ever known. That summer, Queen Victoria celebrated her Golden Jubilee, 50 years of rule, with endless parades and opulent displays of power. Never had the city looked more prosperous, more untouchable. Gas lamps flickered like earthbound stars along cobbled lanes, casting trembling shadows across Georgian facades and towering Victorian mansions. The air itself seemed heavy, with Empire coal smoke sweetened the breeze rolling off the Thames, blending with the steady rhythm of hooves over stone and the distant rumble of carriages. By day, the streets bustled with merchants, clerks, and maids, their hurried footsteps bouncing off limestone walls. But by night, the city transformed. Gaslight carved pools of gold into the dark, leaving entire blocks swallowed in shadows too deep to measure. And it was within those shadows that something ancient began to stir. The neighborhood of Belmere had become the jewel of the new industrial aristocracy. Unlike the old nobles with their distant country estates, these were men who built fortunes through steam steel and colonial trade. Their pristine white townhouses with wrought iron balconies and precisely trimmed hedges stood not just as homes but monuments to Britain's global dominance. The Eberle family owned textile mills that sprawled across Lancashire and Manchester, employing thousands. The family patriarch, Lord Alaric Eberle, was a stern, silver-whiskered man known for his sharp gaze and sharper business instincts. He had purchased his Belmar estate for 12,000 Tullal, an enormous sum, even for the time, paying not just for the bricks and glass, but for the status it promised. His wife, Lady Isadora Eberle, 20 years younger and known for a kind of effortless beauty, born from a life of luxury, held lavish evening salons. Politicians, artists, financiers, all passed through her candlelit dining room beneath oil paintings of past conquests. On the opposite end of Belmire resided the Cavendrin family, who had made their fortune importing tea and opium from the Far East. Their clipper ships dashed across the Indian Ocean, their hulls heavy with cargo that filled the city's warehouses and their ledgers. The youngest Cavendrin heir, Julian inherited not only a considerable fortune, but also a taste for the arts. His Chester Lane townhouse had become a quiet legend in London's bohemian circles, a place where writers, actors, composers, and thinkers gathered under low lamplight, debating the latest waves of European thought and theatre. They believed themselves at the peak of the world, untouchable, refined, surrounded by wealth and wonder. But what none of them realized was that something had begun to move within their polished corridors and locked drawing rooms. It listened, it smiled, it waited. The Pendleton family fortune was carved straight from the blackened lungs of the Welsh and northern English hills. Beneath the heathered slopes lay vast seams of coal-black gold that fed the furnaces of factories, the boilers of ships, and the heart of Britain's relentless industry. It was in these soot-choked tunnels that Lord William Pendleton had begun his life not as a nobleman, but as the son of a miner. And yet, through sheer ambition and the ruthless instincts of a born capitalist, he had climbed from the coal pits to the drawing rooms of the aristocracy. Though he wore tailored waistcoats and spoke in polished turns of phrase, William had never entirely shed the edge of his working-class accent. To the entrenched old families of Belmere, he remained unmistakably nouveau riche, a power broker, yes, but not quite one of their own. Patrolling these rarefied streets was Inspector Alistair Greaves of Scotland Yard, a fixture in the Met for over 15 years. Greaves had begun his career pounding the dangerous beats of Whitechapel, dodging drunken brawls and tracking pickpockets through rat-filled alleys. But his mind, sharp, organized, and relentlessly curious, had carried him steadily upward through the ranks. Now at 45, he was one of the most trusted detectives in the yard. A grammar school education had left him fluent in Latin and Greek, and his reputation among colleagues was that of a man equally at home discussing Homer or homicide. Though he could mingle with earls and industrialists when duty required, Greaves never forgot his roots. He was the son of a blacksmith from Hampshire, and his bearing still carried something of the forge, tall and wiry, with steel-grey hair and strong hands, still rough from his youth, spent hammering iron into shape. His eyes, dark, steady, and deeply set, held the quiet weight of a man who had seen the worst of mankind, and still clung to the stubborn belief that justice mattered. Greaves lived alone in a modest boarding house on Montmore Street, just a short walk from the British Museum. A lifelong bachelor, he found his closest company in books. His sitting room was filled floor to ceiling with histories, crime reports, and Greek philosophy. On quieter evenings, he could be found nursing a single pint at the Fox and Lockhart Tavern, deep in discussion, with fellow officers replaying strange cases and unsolved mysteries over the low murmur of the city's shifting breath. Autumn of 1887 had arrived with unusual cruelty. By the first week of October, frost was already whitening the lawns of Hyde Park. And from the Thames, thick yellow fogs rolled over the city like a blanket of damp wool soaked in smoke. These weren't the delicate mists of romantic poems. No, these were the infamous pea-soupers born from the thousands of coal fires burning day and night across London. They clung to your coat, stung your eyes, and tasted of sulphur and ash. On such nights, visibility dropped to mere yards, The city, so familiar by daylight, became an alien maze of vanishing outlines. Gas lamps flickered helplessly in the haze, their glow swallowed by fog. So thick it seemed to muffle sound itself. From the murk, the rhythmic clatter of hooves would suddenly emerge, followed by the ghostly silhouette of a hansom cab, drifting like a phantom, then swallowed once again by the dark. They said that Jack the Ripper would one day use those very fogs to his advantage in the East End, but those horrors still lay almost a year in the future. In Belmire, the rich still believed they were immune. Behind their wrought iron gates, velvet curtains, and watchful servants, they convinced themselves the violence of the East End could never find its way west. They trusted in class, in money, in status. But that trust would soon be shattered. For in the labyrinth of fog-wrapped streets and gaslit alleys, death could take any form, even the form of echoing laughter, drifting through the cold night long after the voice that made it was gone. October 15th, 1887. A date that would mark the beginning of something far more terrifying than anyone in Belmire could have imagined. The scream that tore through the pre-dawn stillness of Belmore Square came from Lady Evelyn Ashcombe. She had returned early from a charity gala at the Royal Opera House, an abrupt end to an evening of stiff champagne and stiff conversation, only to find the front door of her townhouse slightly ajar. From the gap flowed thick fingers of autumn fog curling in across her marble floor, like ghostly hands feeling their way through a tomb. The fog that night was heavier than usual, one of London's dreaded pea soupers, thick with soot and coal smoke. Gas lamps along the square cast faint yellow halos, but beyond their reach, everything vanished into a swirling wall of green-grey mist. Lady Evelyn's hired cab had been forced to crawl at walking pace, its driver shouting tentative warnings into the murk for any unseen carts or pedestrians. She had left the opera before the final act, claiming a headache. In truth, she had grown weary of the evening, a charity function, draped in obligation masked as generosity. The Wagner performance had droned on endlessly, and she found herself thinking less of arias and more of the comfort of home. Her drawing room, a proper cup of Darjeeling, and the familiar scent of her own lavender cushions. She wore her finest emerald gown that evening, the one that brought out the fire in her auburn hair and made her green eyes catch the gaslight like glass. But as the second act bled into the third, even her perfectly tailored silk felt more like a costume than attire. The journey home had taken nearly twice as long as it should have. Belmore's grand landmarks disappeared in the thick fog, and the cobbled streets seemed to rearrange themselves into a maze of grey sameness. Even her veteran cabman had to stop twice, squinting up at soot-darkened street signs to confirm their location. The fog pressed against the cab's windows like something alive, watching breathing. Lady Evelyn clutched her opera cloak tighter and focused on the rhythmic clatter of hooves, letting it lull her into a fragile calm. But as they turned the final corner into the square, that calm shattered. The front door was open. Not wide, but enough for her to notice immediately. A single wedge of warm gaslight spilled out onto the stone steps, cutting through the fog like a golden beacon. This was not just unusual, it was unthinkable. Mrs. Eleanora Whitfield. Her head housekeeper had been with the Ashcombe household for over 2 decades. She was a woman of severe habits, her devotion to order bordering on obsession. Never, not once in 23 years had she left a door unlocked, let alone open to the London night. Lady Evelyn's first thought was concern. Perhaps Mrs. Whitfield had taken ill, she had been slowing down of late. Nearly 60 now, her once precise routines had grown just a touch erratic. Just last week, Evelyn had noticed the housekeeper speaking under her breath as she walked the halls, muttering strange clipped syllables when she thought no one was listening. The younger servants had whispered that Mrs. Whitfield had been holding entire conversations in empty rooms. When confronted, the woman merely smiled and claimed she was practicing her enunciation old habits from her day's training under a former governess. Or so she said. Now climbing the steps in damp evening slippers, Lady Evelyn hesitated at the open door. She peered into the swirling fog behind her, then back into the golden light inside. A strange stillness clung to the entryway, too quiet, too still. The gas sconces on the walls flickered slightly, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. Mrs. Whitfield, Eleonora. "Are you quite well?" She called, her voice soft but purposeful. The fog seemed to swallow her words. Even to her own ears they sounded distant, muffled as if spoken from across a great and empty room. What she would find beyond the threshold would shake Belmire to its core, but we'll leave that moment hanging for now. In fog like this, things don't always reveal themselves right away. Stay close and don't lose your way. Sleepy History Tales continues in the next part. The gas jets in the entry hall fluttered violently, reacting to the icy breath of fog still slipping through the open door. Shadows danced along the polished marble floor, flickering across the gilt-framed portraits of solemn ancestors lining the walls, each face twisted by the uncertain light, as though turning to watch. In the main drawing room, just beyond the grand archway, Mrs. Eleonora Whitfield lay sprawled across the thick Persian carpet. She had been the Ashcombe family's housekeeper for 23 years, unyielding, precise, and respected like the ticking of a well-kept clock. And now, she was dead. But it wasn't the death itself that would haunt Lady Evelyn Ashcombe for the rest of her life. It was the manner of it. The body was posed deliberately, almost lovingly. Her silver hair, usually bound in a tight functional knot, had been carefully arranged around her head like a halo. Every strand seemed placed by an invisible hand that understood symmetry and ritual. Her worn hands that had polished silver pressed linens and opened countless doors were folded across her chest in the pose of a peaceful burial. But her face defied everything else. Mrs. Whitfield's expression was frozen in the throes of pure radiant joy. Her mouth stretched wide in an open laugh, eyes creased as if caught in a moment of overwhelming delight. It was no grimace, no mask of death. It was happiness, so genuine, so vivid, that for one breathless moment, Lady Evelyn half expected the old woman's distinctive chuckle to echo through the room. But the stillness held. Around the body, chaos reigned. Furniture had been overturned violently. A priceless Chinese vase lay shattered near the hearth, its shards scattered among fallen books and crushed porcelain. One of the heavy velvet curtains had been torn clean from its rail. Even the horsehair sofa, a family heirloom, was littered with fragments of smashed figurines. There had clearly been a struggle. And yet, in the heart of the wreckage lay Mrs. Whitfield's body, arranged like a final mocking still life. Inspector Alistair Greaves arrived just as the first pale light of dawn began to slip through the fog, bringing with it the subtle chorus of a city awakening milk vendors. Calling from side streets the clatter of hooves, the first clanging carts of the day. His tall, lean frame cut a dramatic silhouette against the swirling mist. His dark coat and bowler hat giving him the look of a figure torn from one of the Gothic novels that filled bookshop windows across London. But Greaves was no fiction, and this crime was like nothing he had seen before. He entered the drawing room in silence, his boots clicking softly against the ruined floor-eyes, immediately locking on the corpse. The signs of violence were unmistakable, raw, almost intimate. Mrs. Whitfield's fingernails were chipped and packed with traces of skin she had fought hard. Deep purple bruises ringed her neck, and both forearms bore cuts and contusions consistent with defensive wounds. She hadn't gone quietly, and yet that smile, that perfect, joyful expression remained. A riddle carved in flesh. "Blimey, sir," whispered Constable James Thornbury, kneeling awkwardly beside the body. His face was pale eyes wide with the unmistakable shock of a man seeing true horror for the first time. Thornbury was only 22, fresh from training, barely seasoned enough to patrol the West End, let alone face a scene like this. "Look at her face," he said quietly. "Whoever did this, it's like she died laughing." Greaves didn't respond. He was already moving with clinical precision, gliding through the debris like a scholar assembling a forgotten manuscript. Every object had meaning. Every overturned chair, every flung cushion, every broken vase whispered a part of the story. The placement of the body, the artful arrangement of the hair, the neatly folded hands, all of it suggested post-mortem manipulation. The killer had stayed, not just to kill, but to stage, to craft a scene designed to unnerve, to puzzle, to communicate. And then Greaves saw the mark. Just below the left collarbone, carved cleanly into Mrs. Whitfield's chest, was a small symbol, precise, deliberate. A theatrical mask, its two halves representing comedy and tragedy, fused into one twisted emblem. A performer, Greaves murmured to himself, or someone who believes they are. Whoever this was, they weren't just a killer, they were an artist. What kind of mind orchestrates joy and death in the same breath, who pauses in the stillness after violence to smile? Sleepy history tales will continue soon, dear viewer. And in the next chapter, we'll follow the first thread pulled loose from this tightly wound mask of civility, and into the shadows it reveals. The kind of theatrical mask carved into the woman's chest was unmistakable, an icon of the grand stages of the West End, where London's cultural elite gathered to witness the latest works by Wilde Shaw and their contemporaries. The incision was shallow, almost reverent, clearly made after death. Its edges were clean, not frenzied. This was no act of spontaneous violence. It was a statement, a signature, a calling card left by a killer who was not only methodical, but theatrical. But it wasn't the symbol that lingered most in Inspector Elias Harrow's mind. It was the scent, not the iron tang of blood or the dull, sour odor of death. No, this was something different. It was oddly sweet, almost medicinal. A perfumed chemical presence that floated through the drawing room like invisible ink, sharp and floral, with undertones of something artificial, lab-born. It reminded Harrow of the ether used by surgeons at St. Bartholomew's, but layered with more intention. He had encountered something like it once before 3 years ago during an investigation into a disgraced physician experimenting with untested anesthetics on indigent patients at Bethlehem Royal Hospital. That case ended in suicide and fire, but the smell, this strange bittersweet trace, had stayed with him, and now it was back. Lady Evelyn Blackwood sat shivering beside the hearth, her velvet opera cloak still wrapped tightly around her slender frame. The fire crackled, but it did little to chase the chill from her bones. Her eyes, rimmed with fatigue, stared into the middle distance as she spoke. "I arrived home shortly after midnight," she said quietly, her voice cultured and composed, but frayed at the edges. "We left the Royal Opera before the end. I told my companions I had a headache, but truthfully, I simply couldn't endure another act of that dreadful Wagner performance. I returned alone just after 11. She paused, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief monogrammed with her family's crest. Mrs. Whitlow should have been in bed long before. She always retired at 10 sharp, never missed a night. She'd inspect every gas lamp, check each log twice over. She's been with the family since before I married Charles. Not once has she ever broken from routine. What Lady Evelyn didn't know, what would soon become one of the most haunting details of the entire investigation, was something murmured in hushed tones by more than one neighbor in the days that followed. Mrs. Gertrude Penhallow, who lived directly opposite the Blackwood residence, told Inspector Harrow something chilling. "I heard her," she whispered, wringing her hands in her lap. "After 2 in the morning. I know because I couldn't sleep. I rarely do when the fog's that thick." She was a woman in her 60s, comfortably widowed and not prone to exaggeration. It was laughter, Inspector. A woman's laughter. Bright, unrestrained, joyful. Coming from the Blackwood house, and it went on for nearly an hour. Harrow frowned. "You're certain of the time?" "Quite certain. I was reading by the window. The fog blurred everything, but sound travels strangely on nights like that." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "At first I thought perhaps Lady Evelyn had company, some midnight gathering. But this laughter? It wasn't normal. It was too loud, too gleeful, like something from a child's game. It made the hair on my neck stand up. I closed the curtains. I couldn't bear to hear it any longer." The first victim had now been claimed by the one the newspapers would soon christen the Laughing Man. Though his identity remained cloaked in mystery, as elusive as the fog rolling through the gaslit alleys of Victorian London, Inspector Elias Harrow knew this was more than just a murder. It was a challenge to logic itself. A case that mocked the tools of science and deduction he had spent his career sharpening. Word of the killing swept through Belgravia like fire in dry brush. Despite the Blackwood family's best efforts to keep the affair quiet, whispers began threading their way through gentlemen's clubs and parlor rooms, fueled by curiosity and fear. Within days, speculation outpaced fact. The tragic death at the Blackwood estate morphed into Gothic legend, twisted with each retelling until the original crime was barely recognizable beneath layers of rumor. The Times, ever discreet in its service to London's high society, offered only a carefully sanitized notice. It was buried on page 6, nestled between ads for liver tonics and an announcement for a charity musical. A domestic tragedy in Belgrave Square, the headline read. The brief account merely noted that Mrs. Eleanor Whitlow, a long-serving member of the Blackwood household, had died under circumstances currently under police investigation. But the penny press was not so restrained. The illustrated police news, known for its garish woodcut prints and sensational prose, splashed the story across its front page with the headline, "Mysterious Death in Belgravia Servant Found with Ghastly Smile." The drawing accompanying the article bore little resemblance to reality. Mrs. Whitlow's features grotesquely exaggerated, the mask on her chest rendered like a stage prop from a horror play. But it captured the morbid imagination of the public. The legend of the Laughing Man was born. Inspector Harrow now found himself walking a perilous line. His investigation had to be both thorough and politically delicate. The Blackwood family was no ordinary household. Lord Charles Blackwood was a sitting member of the House of Lords with heavy investments in the Empire's railways and friendships that reached into the cabinet itself. One wrong step could end a promising career or conversely bring rapid promotion. But Harrow's conscience, forged over 15 years among London's darkest alleys and roughest districts, wouldn't allow for shortcuts. He had seen too many crimes buried under silk and privilege. Too many names erased from ledgers because they belonged to those without titles or fortunes. Mrs. Eleanor Whitlow may have worn a maid's apron instead of a coronet, but she deserved the same justice as any duchess. His initial inquiries into her life revealed a woman of remarkable character, born Eleanor Caldwell in the Yorkshire village of Greymore. She had come to London at 18 in search of work. Through hard labor, sharp intellect, and a keen understanding of the intricate unwritten rules that governed a Victorian household, she had risen from scullery maid to head housekeeper. For over 2 decades, she had served the Blackwood family with quiet devotion. Within the household, she was respected and even loved. The younger staff, still trembling in the aftermath of her death, spoke of her with genuine reverence. She was strict but never cruel, whispered Sarah Penrose, the young kitchen maid who had discovered the body. She stood wringing her hands, her voice tight with grief. Always fair. She'd scold if you were careless, but she'd also stay up late teaching you how to fold linens just so. She said dignity mattered whether you served it or wore it. Inspector Harrow listened carefully, not just to the girl's words, but to the fear behind them. Something had shattered in that house, not just a life, but a sense of order. And in its place, something darker had taken root. Thomas Harrogate, longtime butler to the Blackwood family and closest colleague to Mrs. Whitlow among the household staff, offered a portrait of quiet admiration. She took pride in everything she did. Harrogate said, his usually rigid posture softening as he spoke. She knew this house better than any of us. Every silver fork, every crystal glass, every Blackwood custom, going back generations. Lady Margaret depended on her entirely, as did his lordship. She wasn't just staff inspector. She was the soul of this home. Yet, as glowing as his tribute was, other servants hinted at a different side to Mrs. Whitlow, a side that had emerged only in the weeks before her death. Several mentioned her strange new habit of speaking aloud to unseen companions while going about her duties. They described it not as delusion but as something more theatrical. She always had a flair for the dramatic, or Mrs. Whitlow said young Sarah Penrose with a faint smile, gaining confidence as she spoke. Sometimes you'd hear her in the wine cellar or back pantry, talking as though she were hosting a play, putting on voices, noble ladies, street vendors, even the Irish and the Scots. She gave a small laugh, though it faltered quickly. It was all in good fun, gave the place a bit of life. This detail struck Inspector Harrow like the first crack in a mirror. A woman fascinated by theatrical performance. A killer who left behind a carved mask and a corpse frozen in a grotesque, joyous grin. The threads, though fragile, were starting to weave themselves into something larger. It was enough to prompt the inspector to broaden the scope of his investigation from the halls of the Blackwood estate to the flickering footlights of London's theatre world. In 1887, the West End was a universe of its own, a gleaming world of velvet curtains, limelight, and whispered ambition. The grand playhouses like the Lyceum under the famed Henry Irving drew crowds nightly, while upstarts like the Savoy experimented with electric lighting and the daring new realism of George Bernard Shaw and Oscar Wilde. Actors, playwrights, and set builders all moved in tight circles, and word traveled fast when something strange stirred within them. It didn't take long for whispers to reach Harrow's ears. A mysterious gentleman, well-dressed, always alone, never speaking to anyone, yet unmistakable for one reason. He laughed, not chuckled, not politely, but full booming laughter in the most inappropriate of moments. He would erupt during death scenes, cackle through emotional confessions, roar when tragedy struck the stage. Several managers recounted complaints. One of them, Albert Grimby, steward of the Lyceum, agreed to speak with Harrow directly. They met in the empty theatre one grey November afternoon. Without the gaslights and evening crowd, the space felt cavernous and spectral. Dust hung in beams of filtered daylight like stage smoke. He came 3 nights in a row. Grimby said, his voice hushed as they stood beneath the velvet-draped boxes. Always the same seat, always alone, never clapped, never spoke. But when Lady Macbeth had one of her fits or a soldier died, he'd burst out laughing. Loud, wild, not right. He paused, visibly unsettled by the memory. It echoed. You could feel it in your ribs. Mr. Irving heard him from the stage. He wasn't pleased. The gentleman, Grimby continued, had eventually been asked not to return. He took it well though, smiled, nodded, said he quite understood. Then Grimby leaned in, his voice dropping a full octave. Said we'd done a fine job, you see. Captured what was it? He said, "Ah, yes. The authentic absurdity of mortality." Those were his exact words, Inspector. Harrow felt a chill settle in the pit of his stomach. The mask was no longer just a metaphor. It was a calling card. Inspector Nathaniel Harrow stood quietly as Alfred Penrose, the Harringtons' loyal butler and closest colleague of the late Miss Beatrice Ward, recounted her life with unmistakable reverence. She took great pride in everything she did. Penrose murmured his usual stiffness, giving way to genuine affection. Beatrice knew every inch of this house, every bit of silver, every plate of china, every guest's name, and their proper seat at supper. Lady Eleanor depended on her. So did Lord Reginald. She wasn't just a housekeeper, Inspector. She was this household's soul. Yet, as heartfelt as the testimonies were, Harrow soon uncovered a far more curious side to Miss Ward's final weeks. Several servants described her engaging in long, animated monologues with seemingly invisible companions as she went about her chores. She was always theatrical. Our Beatrice said Maggie Trenton a scullery maid, warming to her story. We'd hear her in the pantry doing all sorts of voices, 1 minute speaking, like a duchess the next, like a Cockney flower girl. And then maybe she'd turn into a Scottish fisherman. This eccentricity took on a chilling new relevance in light of the carved theatrical mask found on Miss Ward's chest and that awful frozen smile that had turned her death into a grotesque performance. Harrow's instincts began to stir. The masks, the laughter, the assumed characters, it all seemed to whisper of the stage. So friends, that's exactly where he turned next. London's West End in 1887 was a swirling world of velvet curtains, gaslights, and secrets whispered in dressing rooms. It was an age where the greats Wildshaw and Pinero challenged society's stiffness with wit and grit. From the Grand Corinthia Playhouse to the newly electrified Savoy Theatre, Harrow walked the city's dramatic veins, seeking any link to a killer who seemed to crave more than blood, someone who demanded an audience. It was during one of these backstage inquiries that Harrow first heard of a peculiar figure haunting both the music halls and legitimate theaters alike. He was always alone, always overdressed, and most disturbingly, he laughed. But not at the jokes. No, he laughed during death scenes, weeping soliloquies and ghostly monologues. Augustus Clem, the gaunt manager of the Corinthia Playhouse, recounted it grimly as he walked Harrow through the ghostly rows of velvet seats one rainy afternoon. He came 3 nights running during Macbeth, Inspector Clem said. Sat in the same box alone. When Lady Macbeth raved about her blood-stained hands, he laughed as if it were a vaudeville act, not a chuckle-a-raw. Made the hair on my neck stand up. Clem's voice dropped. Mr. Addison, the actor playing Macbeth, he nearly broke character mid-scene. We asked the gentleman not to return. He was polite about it. Said, "Quite right. Death is the finest comedy of all, don't you think? Not exactly your average theatregoer, wouldn't you say?" Yet, when Harrow pressed for a description, things only grew stranger. Some remembered a tall, mustached figure with a soldier's bearing. Others described a pale, scholarly type with thinning hair and soft hands. Always well-dressed, always attentive, always laughing, where no sane person should. Then, 3 weeks after Miss Ward's death came the next tragedy. This time it was Mr. Jonathan Addington, a scholar-turned-gentleman, found dead in his Chester Square study under eerie circumstances. His manservant, a jumpy youth named Hugh Ellis, arrived at 7 a.m. to find the door locked from the inside. No response. After breaking the door open with the help of the household cook and a locksmith, they discovered Mr. Addington seated upright in his leather reading chair by the fire velvet robe, neatly tied book in hand. At first glance, he looked like any wealthy bachelor, dozing after a long night of reading. But that smile, that horrible, wide, rapturous grin was identical to the one on Beatrice Ward's face. A grin not of joy, but of something beyond mocking, ecstatic, and terrifying. Unlike the Harrington drawing room, which had been left in chaos, Addington's study was perfectly in order. Nothing disturbed. Books lined the shelves with geometric precision. The volume open in his lap. A collection of plays by Oscar Wilde turned to a scene from The Importance of Being Earnest. Inspector Harrow couldn't ignore the irony. The line on the open page mocked the seriousness of suffering. But it wasn't the book that haunted Harrow. It was The Neighbors. Mrs. Eugenia Mulgrave, the Addingtons' next-door neighbor, told the inspector she heard laughter all through the night. It was just after 3, she said, fingers trembling as she poured tea. Not chuckling. Laughter that echoed, "Inspector." It went on and on. I finally took laudanum around 4, but even in my dreams, I could still hear it. This wasn't mere coincidence anymore. Jonathan Addington's background couldn't have been more different from Beatrice Ward's. A Cambridge-educated bachelor with a passion for psychology and theatre, Addington was a patron of the arts and known for hosting salons that attracted playwrights, scientists, and cultural radicals. Wilde had visited his home. So had Bernard Shaw. Addington never married, preferring the companionship of books and ideas. His private library held over 3,000 volumes, many focused on the emerging science of human emotion. But what tethered Addington to Beatrice? They lived in different worlds, she in the servants' wing, he in high society's parlor. And yet, both had died with that same manic expression, both somehow laughing even after their deaths. It was Constable Felix Dane, eager to redeem himself after nearly fainting at the first scene, who uncovered the clue that unraveled it all. While searching behind Addington's massive desk, Dane noticed something odd. A wood panel that gave way under pressure. Behind it, a hidden compartment. Inside, an assortment of objects that would shift the investigation into darker, stranger territory. But that, dear listener, is a mystery for the next chapter. Stay with us, fellow night owls of sleepy history tales. The deeper we go, the stranger it gets. Not exactly the kind of detail you'd expect from your average theatre-goer, is it? But when Inspector Alistair Merrick questioned the managers and staff from various venues across the West End, the accounts of this elusive figure were not only inconsistent, they bordered on the surreal. Some described a tall man with dark hair and a cavalry-style mustache dressed like a fashionable officer. Others swore he was shorter, clean-shaven, and pale like a scholar who hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. It was as though they were describing different people entirely, or one person capable of transforming himself at will. Yet, there were 3 unsettling consistencies. The man always wore expensive evening attire, befitting the aristocracy. He seemed eerily familiar with each performance, as if he'd attended the rehearsals or memorized the scripts in advance. And most disturbingly, he always laughed. But not where you'd expect. Not during jokes or comic relief, but in moments of despair, heartbreak, and fear. It was as if sorrow amused him. 3 weeks after the Whitmore murder, just as London's winter fog began creeping through every alley and lamplit street, the killer struck again. This time, the victim was Mr. Julian Cavell, the youngest son of the Cavell Tea Company, a family name practically synonymous with colonial fortune. He was discovered in his study at Chester Square under circumstances that were as bizarre as they were chilling. The first to find him was his young valet, Thomas Elwood, barely 20, still new to the household. Elwood had arrived at his usual hour, 7 a.m., to prepare the fire and lay out breakfast. But when he knocked on the study door, there was no answer. He tried again. Nothing. The door was locked from the inside. Panic set in. Eventually, the house cook called for a locksmith, and what they found behind that door? Well, let's just say it stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Mr. Cavell was seated upright in his favorite high-backed leather armchair, dressed in his velvet burgundy smoking jacket, his hands resting on the arm as though he had just finished a quiet evening of reading. His head was tilted back slightly. At a glance, you might think he had dozed off, but his face, oh his face, that grotesque expression of laughter frozen across his features. The same rapturous mocking grin worn by poor Mrs. Whitmore, as though death had come and whispered a joke only he could hear. Yet, unlike the chaotic scene at the Whitmore residence, the Cavell study was untouched, pristine. Not a cushion disturbed or a single book out of place on the elegant mahogany shelves. On Julian's lap lay an open book, a leather-bound collection of comedies by Oscar Wilde, turned to a page from The Importance of Being Earnest. Inspector Merrick couldn't help but notice the passage highlighted on the page, Lady Bracknell's famously biting remark about dignity in the face of social embarrassment. A cruel kind of irony, wouldn't you say? But the most disturbing revelation came not from the scene itself, but from the testimony of the neighbors. Mrs. Eloise Penbrook, a widowed socialite living in the adjoining townhouse, told the inspector something that still sends shivers down my spine. "I heard laughter," she said softly during her interview the following morning. Laughter coming through the walls after midnight, and it didn't stop. Now these homes, grand Georgian structures, were built for privacy. Their walls were thick, designed to muffle any noise unbefitting a respectable address. Yet she claimed the laughter was so clear it might have been in her own drawing room. It went on for hours. She continued, her hand trembling as she poured tea into delicate porcelain cups. Not the short burst of mirth you'd expect from reading a clever line. This was something else. It would stop, then start again, louder, like waves. She said she finally took a sleeping powder at 4 a.m. Even then, the laughter followed her into her dreams. Merrick dug into Cavell's background, and what he found only deepened the mystery. Julian Cavell couldn't have been more different from Abigail Whitmore. Where she was a housekeeper from modest roots, he was a man of refined education and independent wealth, a Cambridge scholar, a lover of literature, and a known patron of the arts. His salons in Chester Square were legendary. Twice a week, London's most brilliant minds, playwrights, critics, even Oscar Wilde himself would gather in his library to debate art, philosophy, and science. George Bernard Shaw had reportedly argued heatedly about social morality in that very room just months before Cavell's death. Julian had never married. He had no heirs. His passion, as Merrick discovered, was knowledge, especially the emerging science of human psychology. In particular, he had become obsessed with the question of authenticity in emotion. Was human expression genuine? Or were all our reactions simply roles performed for social approval? The answer, as it turned out, was hidden, literally behind a wooden panel in Cavell's study. Constable Tobias Fern, still eager to prove himself after nearly fainting at the Whitmore scene, was the one who noticed the loose panel behind the gentleman's massive oak desk. Inside, they found a secret compartment, and within it a diary. Thomas Elbridge, longtime butler of the Alderton estate and closest confidant of the late Mrs. Winifred Blackwell, described her with nothing short of reverence. She was the soul of this house, he told Inspector Lennox in a voice softened by memory. Every bit of silver, every family heirloom, every tradition. She held it all in her mind like a sacred archive. Lady Margaret depended on her. So did Lord Philip. She wasn't just staff, she was family. But as the inspector pressed deeper, a different picture began to emerge. Winifred, beloved as she was, had shown increasingly strange behavior in the final weeks before her death. Several household staff recounted hearing her speaking, to no one holding long animated conversations in empty rooms. She was always one for theatrics, that one said Sarah Kingsley, the scullery maid, warming to her tale. We'd hear her in the wine cellar or pantry, switching voices like she was performing for an audience. One minute, she'd be talking like a noblewoman, all proper and graceful. Then she'd drop into a thick working-class drawl, or sometimes Irish or Scottish. It was like she had a whole cast of characters inside her. These odd performances intrigued Inspector Lennox, especially when he remembered the theatrical mask carved into Winifred's chest and the eerie expression of joy frozen on her face in death. The pattern was forming, but its meaning remained just out of reach. Her flair for performance, her obsession with voices and characters. And now, the killer's morbid sense of theatricality. It all pointed toward one world, in particular London's theatre scene. So, Lennox turned his investigation toward the stages and playhouses of the West End, where velvet curtains parted nightly to reveal the grandeur and tragedy of human life. Here, under the gaslights of 1887, London-famed playwrights like Oscar Wilde and George Bernard Shaw were transforming the stage. Realism, emotion, and societal critique were the new norms. But behind the scenes, another story was quietly unfolding. At the prestigious Halcombe Theatre manager, Albert Grimley, shared a troubling account. There was this man, always alone, always in the same box seat. Came 3 nights in a row during our run of Macbeth, and every time someone died on stage, every mad soliloquy from Lady Macbeth, he would burst out laughing. Not a chuckle, a roar. It echoed through the hall like thunder, gave me the shivers. Other theatre managers shared similar stories. This peculiar gentleman in fine clothes, always alone, never speaking, yet laughing uncontrollably at the most tragic moments. Patrons complained, performers lost focus. The man was eventually asked not to return. And do you know what he said? Grimly recalled. He told us he understood entirely and that he appreciated our authentic portrayal of mortality's absurdity. Those were his exact words. It was at that moment Lennox realized this was no ordinary killer. This was someone with a profound obsession, the raw, unfiltered essence of human emotion. And they were watching, studying, recording. Hidden in a sealed drawer at the late Geoffrey Calden's residence, police discovered a slim, leather-bound diary. The writing inside, neat, meticulous, increasingly manic, revealed a descent into obsession. June 3rd, 1887. Attended the Pevensey dinner tonight. Observed the Alderton housekeeper, Mrs. Blackwell. While the guests tittered politely, her laughter stood out. It was real, pure, unfiltered. I must observe her again under more controlled conditions. Another entry. 2 weeks before Geoffrey's death, have made contact with Dr. H. He has agreed to begin trials. Our compound, still unstable, promises to bypass the filters of social etiquette, to break through to something true. Then, just 2 days before his death, tomorrow it begins. I shall be the first subject. Whatever discomfort I endure is worth it for science, for truth. We must understand what lies beneath the masks we wear. Inspector Lennox read the last entry with a chill crawling up his spine. Jeffrey hadn't been murdered. He had volunteered for some kind of horrific emotional experiment. But who was Dr. H? Beneath the diary, Constable Dawes found letters signed only with the initial H. The tone was clinical. The handwriting, controlled, discussing formulas, doses, chemical reactions, and warnings. Your theories intrigue me, one letter said. Emotion as it is expressed socially is performance. We must strip that away. My latest compound may achieve just that, but it is volatile. A single miscalculation and the subject may not survive. Lennox's mind raced. This wasn't random violence. It was experimentation, a calculated pursuit of raw human emotion at the cost of human life. And Mrs. Blackwell. Perhaps not a victim chosen at random, but a subject selected for her expressive talents. The killer wasn't just a murderer. They were a scientist, and London was their laboratory. As you shiver at this unfolding horror, dear viewer, take a moment to breathe. If this dark mystery has you hooked, share it with a friend who loves Victorian-era chills. Tap the like button, it helps. Sleepy History Tales keep the stories flowing. And if you haven't already subscribed, there's more to uncover in this twisted tale. Because as Inspector Lennox would soon discover, the story had only just begun. The theatrical elements weren't mere quirks, they were carefully chosen symbols, embedded like stage directions in a grim performance. They represented something far deeper, a contrast between the masks we wear in polite society and the raw, untamed truths we hide beneath. Just when you think the nightmare in London's most elegant quarter has reached its peak, it twists deeper. If you're still with us, dear listener, and this tale is sending shivers down your spine, do share it with someone who loves a mystery wrapped in shadows. A quick like helps keep the gas lamps burning. Here at Sleepy History Tales, and a subscription means you won't miss what's still to come in this twisted waltz through Victorian darkness. Now, back to the story. Detective Elias Trenholm was no longer chasing a typical murderer. The grim reality had begun to surface. He was chasing someone conducting human experimentation. A mind steeped in advanced chemistry, shadowy psychology, and the chilling belief that people were tools to be taken apart and understood. His investigation led him into circles he'd never imagined, intellectual societies hidden behind polished doors in the fog-choked heart of London. The late Geoffrey Alton had once mingled with these groups, rubbing shoulders with men of science and speculation alike. It was the smaller, more obscure gatherings that caught Trenholm's attention. Clubs like the Society for Psychical Inquiry and the London Institute of Human Variation, eccentric enclaves where theories of emotion and consciousness were debated like philosophy over brandy and smoke. One name returned again and again: Dr. Nathaniel Ashcroft. Once a well-regarded physician, Ashcroft had lost his license 3 years earlier after disturbing reports surfaced unauthorized trials on mentally ill patients at the infamous Blackmare Asylum. Yes, that Blackmare, where the screams of the forgotten echoed through corridors. long after the gas lamps were doused. Dr. Ashcroft had once been hailed as a pioneer, a gifted mind with a Harley Street practice and a client list of the upper class. But over time, something shifted. He became consumed by a single idea that every human emotion left behind a signature in the muscles of the face. He wanted to capture joy itself. Not the smile we show guests at tea, but the raw, untamed surge of happiness unfiltered by civility. He was brilliant, but terrifying. Professor Lionel Kettering admitted to Detective Trenholm as they sat in a cluttered office at University College. Nathaniel believed we could induce true emotion through chemicals, not just mimicry, but actual internal transformation. According to Kettering, Ashcroft believed joy was the hardest state to manufacture, the most genuine, the most protected. His dream was to strip away all performance and reveal the bare truth underneath. But by the time Elias Trenholm caught up to the doctor's trail, Ashcroft was already gone. Vanished from his Bloomsbury lodgings weeks earlier, he left behind nothing but a trail of horror. The landlady, Mrs. Edna Butterley, remembered him well. Polite, always paid on time. But the smells, Inspector, sweet and sharp like rot under perfume. And the noises. Sometimes I'd hear him reciting things, like speeches or rituals. Inside the abandoned rooms, Trenholm uncovered something grotesque behind a false wall, a complete laboratory. Beakers, powders, notes, and something worse. One notebook described an experiment in brutal detail. Subject exhibits involuntary laughter. 15 minutes post-administration. Escalates to full euphoria by minute 45. Subject conscious, unable to cease vocalization. Muscular contractions persist post-mortem. Compound affects nervous system at root level. The handwriting was calm, clinical, as if describing the weather. And the horror didn't end there. Reports were coming in, unsettling ones, from Belgravia's elite. Lady Rosalind Pennell, who lived just a few streets from the Alton household, had noticed odd disturbances during a recent trip away. Nothing stolen, but everything moved. Someone had gone through my private papers, she whispered, pouring tea with shaking hands. My books on theatre, all missing, but nothing of value taken. It felt like someone had been studying me. She wasn't alone. Lord Everett Margrave reported a similar break-in. But the thief, if you could call them, that had passed by priceless manuscripts, taking only his volumes on psychology, anatomy, and stagecraft. Whoever it was, Margrave said they weren't stealing. They were researching. But the most chilling story came from Mrs. Clara Redwin, a widow who lived directly across from the site of the first murder. For weeks, she'd seen a man watching her house. He wasn't a thief, she insisted. He was studying me, like I was part of something. Mrs. Redwin's description matched several theatre accounts of the strange gentleman who laughed at the wrong moments. Tall, well-groomed, educated, but off. Always just a shade wrong. Detective Trenholm began to connect the threads. Lady Pennell, Lord Margrave, Mrs. Redwin. All of them had attended a series of lectures on human emotion, given at the Royal Institution by none other than Dr. Nathaniel Ashcroft. Even Alton and Mrs. Winslow, the maid found dead in the alley, had been there. Somehow, even a servant had found her way into those sessions. Ashcroft's talks had been advertised innocently enough. The future of feeling. A scientific inquiry into human emotion. But what no one realized was that the doctor had been selecting his test subjects from the audience itself. He had spoken about stripping away social masks, about chemically reaching into the soul and dragging real emotion to the surface. His theories were radical, dangerous, but they weren't just theories. He was testing them on people. And now, the experiment had evolved into a silent hunt. As winter deepened and London's fog became thick as smoke, Elias Trenholm understood this wasn't about murder anymore. This was about stopping a scientist who saw people as raw material. And the experiment was still underway. When Inspector Alistair Grayson tried to track down the elusive Dr. Elias Marlowe, he found nothing but whispers and traces. Marlowe had vanished from his humble lodgings in Bloomsbury weeks earlier, leaving behind only a disturbing legacy: a stack of notebooks filled with meticulous anatomical sketches of facial muscles and strange chemical formulas, each seemingly crafted to target the human nervous system. His landlady, the sharp-tongued Mrs. Agnes Butterworth, recalled odd behaviors. Strange man, yes, but always polite. Always paid on time, she told Inspector Grayson as she guided him through the abandoned flat that had served as both Marlowe's living quarters and personal laboratory. But the smells, Inspector, sweet, sharp, made your eyes sting, like burning sugar and poison. And sometimes I'd hear him talking to himself, not muttering, projecting like an actor on a stage. What they found hidden behind a false panel in the wall shook Grayson to his core, a fully equipped chemical laboratory. Glass retorts, heating coils, racks of vials filled with luminous powders and liquids. But what was most unsettling were the detailed experiment logs, experiments conducted not on theory, but on people. Though none were named, the notes described terrifying effects. One entry read, "Subject begins involuntary laughter, 15 minutes post-administration. Laughter intensifies over next 30 minutes. Peak euphoria at 45-minute mark. Subject remains conscious but unable to control facial or vocal muscles. Effect persists 6 hours beyond cessation of vital functions. Compound appears to influence nervous system at a cellular level." Chilling. And the nightmare was far from over. Word of other disturbing events had begun circulating among the upper tiers of Belgravia. Lady Vivian Ashcombe, a widow living a few doors from the residence where the first murder occurred, told Grayson she returned from a brief trip to Brighton to find her home undisturbed but wrong. Drawers had been rifled, letters had been read. It was surgical, she said, her eyes narrowed over a teacup in her sunlit parlor. And several books were missing. Not valuables, just old volumes on theatrical acting and the psychology of emotion. Lord Edwin Halberd, another figure of intellectual stature, experienced something eerily similar. His grand library had been broken into. And yet, the intruder passed over rare manuscripts and ancient texts, choosing only books on anatomy theatre and emotional theory. He knew exactly what he wanted. Lord Halberd murmured, puzzled. Not a thief, a researcher. But the most terrifying account came from Mrs. Charlotte Bainbridge, the widow of a prominent solicitor. Her house stood directly across from the very place where the first victim had been found. She described to Grayson a man, tall, elegant, sharply dressed, who had been watching her home from across the street, always from the shadows, always disappearing before she could confront him. He wasn't casing the house, Inspector, she said. He was studying it, like he was observing a specimen under glass. I began to feel like I was being measured. What unnerved Grayson further was that Mrs. Bainbridge's description matched reports from theatre directors across the city. A gentleman of refined appearance who laughed too loud too long at moments that weren't remotely funny. It wasn't just laughter. It was performative, artificial. A realization crystallized. Lady Ashcombe, Lord Halberd, Mrs. Bainbridge. They had all attended the same series of scientific lectures earlier that year, lectures given by Dr. Elias Marlowe at the Royal Institution. So had the first two victims, the young maid Clara Whitfield and the scholar Geoffrey Kerwin. The lectures, advertised as cutting-edge discussions on human emotion and social behavior, had drawn the intellectual elite of London. But no one suspected the truth. Marlowe hadn't just been teaching theory. He had been auditioning subjects. He spoke eloquently about the thin line between genuine and performed emotion, arguing that most feelings were nothing more than learned behaviors, societal masks. And then he posed the provocative idea that chemical intervention could strip away those masks to reveal humanity's raw, untamed core. Audiences thought it was brilliant, perhaps a touch eccentric, but Marlowe had gone further. Behind his eloquent words lay a plan to test his hypothesis on them. As winter settled thick over London and fog turned gaslit streets into a labyrinth of shadows, Inspector Grayson felt the pressure mounting. The case was no longer about catching a killer. It was a desperate race to stop a scientist from continuing a campaign of human experimentation. Marlowe was using murder as a tool of research, and his victims were not random. They were carefully selected participants in a twisted experiment disguised as a public lecture. And perhaps, dear listener, someone in your own neighborhood might have once sat in that very audience. The audience members who had once attended Dr. Hartwell's public lectures at the Royal Institution were far from random choices. They were, in his twisted logic, the perfect blend of intellectual ambition and societal exposure. People curious enough to understand the weight of his theories, yet prominent enough that their mysterious deaths would not go unnoticed. He believed that only by sacrificing the elite on the altar of scientific revelation could he force the medical establishment to recognize the value of his work. He wanted his victims to be seen. Whitmore whispered, his hands trembling as he spoke to investigators, not just to prove a theory, but to send a message. Each murder was both a grotesque experiment and a public thesis, a challenge hurled at a conservative scientific world unwilling to venture beyond ethical boundaries. Dr. Hartwell saw himself not as a killer, but as a pioneer of the human soul. Inspector Alistair Hargrove was sickened by the implications, but it was Whitmore's testimony that finally offered a path forward. The student had provided the precise location of Hartwell's hidden laboratory, nestled deep beneath an abandoned warehouse along the Thames. He also gave the inspector the doctor's movements, his favorite haunts, and most importantly, his patterns. So, when on a damp and fog-heavy evening in December, a ragged street boy arrived at the inspector's door holding an envelope sealed in wax, Hargrove already knew what it was. The note inside was handwritten in an elegant, deliberate script. My dear Inspector Hargrove, your investigation has been admirable if misguided. I am not the villain you presume, but a seeker of truth. If you wish to witness the final revelation of my work, come to the Adelphi Theatre at midnight. Come alone. Tonight, you will see what no other man has dared to imagine, the purest expression of human emotion ever captured. Your inquiry ends this night, as does your limited perception of what it means to feel. S. Hartwell. The trap was obvious, but the inspector had no choice. After months of chasing ghosts and whispers, this was the closest he'd come to confronting the man behind the murders. With silent efficiency, he made preparations. 2 trusted constables would follow at a distance. He carried not only his service revolver, but also a small bottle of smelling salts, his only defense against chemical assault. Then, wrapping his greatcoat tightly against the damp night air, Hargrove stepped into the thick yellow fog that rolled off the Thames like a living thing. The Adelphi Theatre, long since closed to the public, loomed in shadow above the Strand. Its grand columns were ghostly in the flickering gaslight, its broken windows staring blankly into the mist. The back door had been left ajar. A theatrical gesture. Inside the building was silent, save for the faint creak of old timbers and the muffled echo of distant voices. Posters for long-forgotten plays curled on the walls. The scent of dust and old velvet clung to the air. As he crept forward, Inspector Hargrove passed through the very bones of the theatre, empty dressing rooms, shattered dressing mirrors, and the crumbling remnants of what had once been London's grand stage. Then he heard it laughter, followed by voices. Not just one, several. He was not walking into a confrontation with a lone madman. There were others. The main stage was lit by a single calcium spotlight, its harsh white glare throwing monstrous shadows across the faded proscenium. Standing at the center was Dr. Sebastian Hartwell, still impeccably dressed and disturbingly calm, and beside him was someone Hargrove had not expected to see again. Julian Cavell, the younger Cavell brother, presumed murdered, mourned in public, now standing tall, smirking, faintly alive and well, a co-conspirator. Inspector Hargrove, Dr. Hartwell, greeted his voice theatrical and smooth. So punctual, so very predictable. Please have a seat. Front row. You won't want to miss this. The inspector remained, still, his revolver hidden beneath his coat eyes, scanning the stage for other threats. This Hartwell gestured grandly to the empty auditorium is our final demonstration. The culmination of years of work research that will redefine what it means to be human. You believe I'm a criminal. But in time, history will call me something else. A monster. Hargrove said, his voice calm. Hartwell only smiled. The truth, when it emerged that night, would be darker, stranger, and more transformative than even the inspector could have imagined. The truth that Dr. Hartwell revealed in his lengthy speech was more terrifying than anything Inspector Howick had ever imagined. Hartwell, a former physician, and Geoffrey Kendish, who had been presumed dead, had been working in secret for over 2 years to develop a large-scale human experimentation program. Their goal to create and observe purely human emotions under laboratory conditions. What began as academic discussions about the artificial nature of social emotions had gradually degenerated into mass murder, disguised as scientific research. The beauty of our methods, Inspector Kendish said with a cold academic air, is their precision and subtlety. We have succeeded in developing chemical compounds that can induce any emotional state at will, while keeping the subject fully conscious and aware. He spoke of the victims as if they were experimental specimens in an ideal laboratory. Mrs. Whitfield died in a state of absolute joy. Hartwell continued speaking, like a surgeon preparing to perform a delicate operation. Not the social kind, but genuine elation, completely detached from all external circumstances. They watched and recorded every reaction, from the facial twitches of terror to the neurological signs of extreme pain. And their greatest achievement, pure joy, unfettered by Victorian social convention. Even the sounds that continued to be heard after the clinical body had died were, they argued, proof that their compounds could affect consciousness at a deeper level than anyone had ever known. The dramatic mask carved into each victim's chest. Howick now understood was Hartwell's manifesto that all human emotion was theatre, a performance for society. Only through chemicals could true emotion be revealed. But you made a serious mistake in your investigation? Hartwell said, his tone becoming that of a teacher correcting a good student who had failed. You think we randomly selected our victims from the lecture audience, but in fact, each death was carefully staged for our ultimate experiment to strike pure fear into a person who believes he is in control. Howick understood now. He was not the one searching for the killer, but the prey, led through each clue into the final trap. Everything, the testimony, the evidence, the conclusions he had thought were the result of meticulous investigation, was part of the elaborate play that Hartwell and Kendish had concocted. Your colleagues at Scotland Yard won't be coming to help, Kendish said, as if he were merely commenting on the weather. We need someone who is intelligent, calm, accustomed to danger. And you are the perfect choice. Then Dr. Hartwell lifted a small test tube containing a clear liquid glowing dimly in the harsh calcium light. This is the pinnacle of our work. Unlike previous euphoric compounds, this will allow you to experience pure terror, undiluted, inescapable, and remain fully conscious until the very end. But Howick was no easy victim. With 15 years of experience in London's most dangerous districts, he always had at least one backup plan and an ironclad survival instinct. As Hartwell and Kendish approached, the inspector, feigned resignation eyes, downcast hands, silently fumbling in his coat, and then, in a decisive moment, he pulled out a small mirror, the kind used to reflect signals during surveillance. He pointed it at the only light source, the calcium lamp, and it reflected a blinding beam into the eyes of both villains. The struggle took place on the stage of the Adelphi Theatre, amid rows of silent spectators, a silent witness to a battle between justice and scientific madness. Kendish, though educated, was quickly taken down by Howick, who was used to fighting on the streets. Hartwell, temporarily blinded, staggered towards the orchestra pit, still clutching the vial. His scientific precision was his undoing. Hartwell slipped, fell into the pit. The vial shattered on the wooden floor, releasing the panic-inducing compound into the air. Both Hartwell and Kendish, now unconscious, inhaled the chemical they had intended to use to destroy each other. The arrest of Dr. Sebastian Hartwell and Dr. Geoffrey Kendish, and the extensive investigation that exposed the network of accomplices and victims, sent shockwaves through the scientific, medical, and social circles of Victorian London. The repercussions of their actions would reverberate for decades to come. The trial at the Old Bailey in the spring of 1888 quickly became one of the most sensational trials of the era, as the horrifying truth about the collaborative experiments and the conspiracy to deceive both victims and investigators came to light. The trials, presided over by Judge Hawkins and covered by most of London's major newspapers, revealed the full extent of the ruthlessness and cold-bloodedness with which Hartwell and Candish pursued what they called the science of pure emotion. The chemical compounds that Hartwell developed were shown to be far beyond the medical knowledge of the time, demonstrating a level of pharmaceutical preparation far beyond the era in which he lived. Using equipment sourced from hospitals, universities, and chemical suppliers across London, Hartwell created what modern science would recognize as central nervous system drugs, compounds capable of triggering specific emotions while also affecting movement and thinking. Experimental records presented at trial show gross, inhumane, and unethical testing on living humans. Individuals who were treated as test subjects subjected to extreme emotional states so that Hartwell and Candish could collect data. Prosecutor Sir Charles Russell, in his opening statement, described them as the most dangerous type of criminals, those who hide their evil intentions under the guise of academics and social prestige. They did more than murder. They created a monstrous science, and they dressed it up as knowledge. Geoffrey Candish's role in the plot turned out to be far greater than authorities initially suspected. It was his wealth and social connections that enabled Hartwell to conduct the experiments, from renting the premises to selecting his victims. Individuals carefully selected from lectures on emotional psychology that Hartwell gave. Candish's faked death, seemingly a simple act, was in fact elaborately staged using medical techniques and acting to fool even experienced forensic doctors. The investigation revealed that they had been working together secretly for nearly 3 years. What began as philosophical theories about the nature of human emotions morphed into a series of field experiments, first on vulnerable subjects like medical students in need of money, then poor people in workhouses, then on the intellectual elite. They didn't just want data, they wanted recognition. The final murders were ostentatious, designed to force academics to acknowledge their findings. Hartwell's compounds were kept by the government for further study, and the results of those experiments were quickly classified. Many modern historians believe that this research laid the foundation for the use of psychotropic drugs in the Boer War, and even later intelligence operations, though the government has kept it secret to this day. Hartwell himself suffered horribly from the compounds he created. After inhaling a high dose of a phobia agent at the Adelphi Theatre, he suffered permanent psychological damage, living in a state of extreme panic, never able to regain his composure. At trial, Hartwell frequently interrupted, trembled, screamed, and had to be taken away because of his uncontrollable panic attacks. Candish seemed to recover but was not immune to periodic panic attacks. He gave a full testimony describing the experiment in detail, but showed absolutely no remorse for the pain he had caused. The case became a milestone in the history of criminal investigation, proving that evil was not only hidden in the shadows, but could also be disguised as doctors, lecturers, and academics. Inspector Harwick's steadfast, rigorous, and unconventional approach paved the way for the investigation of knowledge criminals, those who use their knowledge and position to commit complex crimes. Harwick was promoted to chief inspector after the case becoming Scotland Yard's leading expert on cases with a scientific or medical element. Although the event left a deep mark on his psyche and career, Harwick continued to serve, frequently being called upon by other police forces across the British Empire to advise on cases that were outside the normal understanding of the law. Detective Alistair Munro would carry the scars of the Hartwell Cavendish case for the rest of his life. What haunted him most wasn't the grotesque nature of the crimes nor the twisted experiments themselves, but a chilling realization. The most dangerous monsters often wore the polished masks of gentleman men who quoted science ethics and progress while extinguishing human lives without remorse. The case changed him. Munro's future investigations frequently centered on educated professionals, doctors, chemists, scholars who had used their expertise to commit crimes the average criminal couldn't have dreamed up. He began to understand that intelligence untethered from conscience was a far greater threat than brute violence ever could be. As for the Adelphi Theatre, the stage upon which the final act unfolded, it underwent a massive renovation in the years that followed. But the construction crews uncovered more than just dust and brick. Beneath the stage lay hidden chambers once used by Dr. Thaddeus Blackwood for his grim experiments. There, among shattered glassware and rusted instruments, were the chemical remains of his terror-inducing compounds, and something worse. Detailed ledgers were found, notes cataloguing each victim diagrams for future trials and correspondences with unnamed collaborators in cities as far away as Vienna and Boston. But perhaps most terrifying was a single list over 50 names of prominent Londoners, MPs, judges, renowned academics, artists, and industrialists. These were not random targets but calculated selections, minds and bodies deemed worthy of study. It was only Munro's intervention that had stopped a horrifying chapter in British history before it could fully unfold. Further investigations led to a grim warehouse near the East End docks. There, Scotland Yard uncovered grisly evidence traces of acid-dissolved bodies, storage tanks used for chemical exposure tests, and journals going back nearly half a decade. The implication was unmistakable. Dr. Blackwood and Everett Langford had been conducting these experiments for years, longer than anyone had imagined, possibly aided by a network that spanned beyond the Empire's borders. Despite Scotland Yard's relentless work, parts of that network remained in the shadows. Some key figures disappeared before they could be questioned. Others were protected by political influence. It suggested something deeply unsettling, that similar programs might have existed elsewhere, cloaked under the veil of science and shielded by institutions meant to protect the public. Dr. Thaddeus Blackwood was sentenced to hang, but due to the extreme psychological deterioration caused by his own chemical inhalation, the sentence was commuted to life imprisonment at Broadmoor Asylum. He died less than 2 years later. Official records cited heart failure brought on by constant, unrelenting terror, a cruel twist of fate for the man who had once weaponized fear itself. Everett Langford, stripped of his wealth and connections, was sentenced to life of hard labor at Pentonville. Once a man of refinement and literary talent, he spent his final years stitching mailbags in the prison workshop. Reports say he suffered chronic hallucinations and nocturnal episodes of uncontrollable laughter. In 1890, his lifeless body was discovered in his cell. Some prisoners swore they'd heard him laughing. For hours before his death, the same haunting laughter that had echoed from their victims. As for the chemical formulas, most were deliberately destroyed by Crown order. A few fragments we now know were preserved in sealed government archives. Some historians speculate that those compounds influenced early psychological warfare techniques during the Boer War and beyond. But the truth remains classified, hidden behind locked doors and redacted files. The so-called Laughing Man murders marked a turning point. Public outcry helped usher in reforms around medical experimentation and stricter ethical standards. The early roots of what we now know as informed consent and research oversight. Detective Munro's case files became foundational reading at police academies across the empire. His meticulous analysis of the psychological motivations behind educated criminals helped shape modern investigative techniques still in use today. Yet, the social impact may have been even greater. Victorian society, once starstruck by unrestrained scientific advancement, began to question the assumption that education equaled virtue. Intellectualism, once seen as an unassailable good, was now viewed with a shadow of suspicion. Could knowledge itself be dangerous? Could the very people entrusted to lead society forward instead become its greatest threat? This nightmare reminded the world that when the pursuit of knowledge becomes untethered from morality, the results can be more horrifying than any act of passion or greed. Dr. Blackwood and Langford weren't driven by profit or revenge. They genuinely believed their work would help humanity. That made them all the more terrifying. So what do you think? Do you believe all the victims were ever truly discovered, or could there still be missing names? Forgotten, test subjects unknown, experiments buried in the shadows of history, the evidence of a broader network. The unclaimed remains, the correspondences with unnamed collaborators. It all suggests the truth may be far larger and far darker than we know. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. This story is just one of many dark corridors in the mansion of our past. If you enjoyed tonight's tale from the gaslit alleys of 1887 London and want more like it, more true stories where horror hides beneath powdered wigs and academic papers, please subscribe to Sleepy History Tales. Tap the bell icon so you don't miss our next journey into the forgotten chapters of the past. And remember, history doesn't sleep. It waits. In the fog, in the files, in the places no one dares to look. Until next time, keep the lamp burning.